Thank you everybody for being here. It's great to see how many of you are interested in access to justice or technologies or the combination. The last time I gave a talk in Canada was in Vancouver in February. It was about tax lawyers, and this was not this kind of crowd. Well, the rumor has it that some of you are here because it might be a class requirement, but you're interested in addition to that. Okay, so one of the exciting things about teaching here, giving this talk is you have a fabulous technology law and society center, and it's very exciting for those of you who haven't done work in connection with that. I urge you to do that because it's really exciting to have that kind of work going on in law faculty. Professor Salzman talked a little bit about my class. I won't talk about it very much, but that really is where I started to think about access to justice technologies. I started teaching it about 6 years ago. And what I want to do today is give you a sense of the possibilities of access to justice technologies and also their limitations. Okay, I started out as a rah-rah enthusiast, and I'm still in many ways that, but I'm also aware that technology can only get you so far in the area of access to justice. So what I want to do first is talk a little bit about the justice gap in the United States, give you a sort of whirlwind tour with pictures of what the technologies, the digital tools look like, and then talk about some of the limitations, the potential and limitations of technology. And I welcome both questions at the end, but also if something I say doesn't make sense, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I'm happy to answer your questions. So, justice gap, if I can get the clicker going here. So, United States, 90% of landlords in the United States are represented by counsel versus 10% of tenants represented by lawyers in court. Our legal services organization, which is federally funded, turns away, it funds a whole number of legal service providers in the United States and is the biggest funding of legal services for people who, for poor people, turns away 50% of people who show up at their doors. And that's people who are actually eligible at 125% of the poverty level. So the demand is overwhelming. In addition to that, that's just the tip of the iceberg. 2/3 of moderate income people have 1 or 2 legal problems a year that they do not bring to legal services. 80 and more for people who are low income. 80% of the Americans can't afford lawyers. And this is an area that we don't know that much about, but it's also really important to keep in mind, there's a tremendous amount of legal activity, legal problems, legal issues that occur ex ante. So these all involve disputes, problems that sort of have erupted that could go to court, these numbers under the first 4 bullets. But if you think about it, every time that you sign a contract, every time that you rent an apartment, every time that you get a credit card, it's a legal transaction, as all of you in law school know. It's a legal transaction. And so there are all these interactions, and people don't have access to lawyers to advise them about it, right? There are no resources there. So there's obviously not enough lawyers to address the problem. And the private market for legal services can only do so much to provide legal representation to people, and government-funded legal services is also inadequate. There's just too much law. The world is flooded with law and with legal questions and legal problems. So there's been in the United States a shift, a rise of access to justice technologies. 10 years ago, lawyers would be very concerned and focusing on how do we make sure that non-lawyers don't get involved, that access to justice technologies don't replace what lawyers do, and concerned that that would mean less adequate access to the legal system. And now what we're talking about is aspirationally 100% effective access to the legal system, and a shift from a view that technologies that give individuals access to justice is only second-class justice, but to a view that maybe they're, in certain circumstances, as good as lawyers, maybe in certain circumstances they might be better than lawyers, right? And those are sort of open questions now, right? So there's been a real 180-degree turn in the United States among leaders in the courts, among leaders in the bar, to thinking that access to justice technologies, or A2J technologies, are part of the solution to the justice gap. So, and in fact, this is a quote from there's a conference of chief justices and chief administrators represent all 50 states, and 2015 they got together and passed a resolution, Resolution 5, with the aspirational goal of 100% access to effective assistance for essential civil legal needs. So 100% access is important, but also effective, right? It doesn't do you any good if you get, you get access to a website, but you don't understand what the website says, right? If you can fill out a form, but the form doesn't actually help you in court, right? It has to be effective. And what's going on in the United States is trying to unpack what that word effective means. And then trying to figure out essential civil legal needs. Turns out to be, as I showed you from the slide before, there are a lot of essential civil legal needs. People have housing problems, landlord problems, housing foreclosure, landlord, consumer debt. The list goes on and on. Regulatory benefits, etc. Okay, so what I want to do now is show you some of the types of tools that have emerged over the last 10 or so years, 15 years, and they've kind of moved in a direction of more and more sophistication. And these are types of tools that are user-facing, meaning that a lay person could use them to find answers to questions, or a lawyer might want to use these tools, or a non-legal service provider who's helping someone get access to law. So let me just show you what they look like. So these are websites, law help websites appear all over the United States, in all 50 states, or almost all, maybe it's 40 I should say. It's a website, you get on the website, it's well designed, and it will get you information in plain language about, in this case, getting mold removed from your apartment, what your legal rights are, etc., and what steps you can take. So are you a tenant with mold in your apartment? If so, you have rights under DC law. And the intent here is to explain to the user, the tenant, what does it mean to have these rights, what do these rights entail, and what they can do about it. Okay, now slightly higher level of sophistication are guided interviews. This is also a very popular format in the United States, this particular platform. I'm always surprised because I find this person to be dorky in the extreme, right? I mean, this is all, but people who use it like it, so, what am I to say, right? They like that. And the idea here is as you answer each question, you move on this highway towards the court, and this is a complaint for custody, and this is a pop-up menu that you can answer yes or no to, and then it will take you to more questions and with more pop-up explanatory menus. This is a fabulous app that was built a few years ago, an expungement app. So in the United States, expungement means getting rid of your legal record and certain, your criminal record. A whole bunch of misdemeanors on your record can be expunged, meaning they are removed forever, meaning you don't have to put them on any kind of employment application, right? And what's cool about this particular tool is all you have to do is put in your case number, and it will go pull out all your files connected with you. It will compare your convictions to expungible convictions, and then it will print out for you the pleading that you need to file in court to get your record expunged. And it saves hundreds of hours of time in having to fill out, having to check the system. It's all automated, completely automated. Okay, and then This has become very big the last few years. This is Modria is actually like, I don't know how, I'm sure a bunch of you have used eBay. When you get into a dispute with somebody, it has all sorts of mechanisms that are automatic to resolve disputes, right, and let you work it out. Same thing, this is actually runs on the platform that eBay runs on, Modria, and it gives you certain, it's online dispute resolution, ODR, and the first two steps, problem diagnosis and direct negotiation, are all automated. All automated. And then it's only when you get to, when the matter escalates and is not resolved, does it bump you up to human beings. Right, so this is an automated online dispute resolution. All right, now I'm worried about time. How am I doing?
They're based on another 35 minutes.
Oh, good. Oh, fine. Fine. Oh, good. Sorry to tell you that I have more time. Okay, so this is, I think, pretty cool, not just because we built it in my class. So this is a what's known as a legal expert system, and it's intended for social workers that go into the homes of homebound elderly clients, right? So social workers aren't there to give legal advice, but they this lets them do a legal health check. Right, so they can go in and ask, and the feature's been added, but they can ask about housing, they can ask about debt, they can ask about financial exploitation. Now it's actually physical abuse that's been added to it. And the idea is a social worker goes in and there's a shorter or longer interview, gets some information, gets all these questions answered. You know, I'm going like this because you carry it on your tablet. And then can send their client to lawyers or give lawyers heads up that there are clients who have certain types of problems, right? So homebound elderly don't usually have the capacity to get to the legal services office, and very often can't recognize the legal problems that they have, and so that's why we call it a legal health check. It's to assess whether they have these problems and give them resources to address them and put them in touch with lawyers. Okay, now this is something new, and I don't have a really good visual for it, but there's actually a legal design expert who teaches at Stanford in the design school and the law school, and she has teamed up with Google to connect plain language, common searches with legal information that they could use, with usable legal information. So you don't have to put in what rights do I have. You can put in my landlord isn't cleaning out the mold, and instead of having to figure out that that's a legal problem, right? And that was in the first website, right? You'd have to still go to the website to figure out that there's a legal problem. Here, you could put in that kind of a problem, and it would diagnose as illegal, and then send the person to legal resources. Okay, and then, and I think I showed the visuals for this. So the other thing that's happening in the United States is that we have a couple of states where Microsoft is building some portals. The idea of a portal is one point of entry, and as they say, and a door for everyone, and no wrong door is the phrase. So one point of entry, and then everything, that point of entry will send individuals to all sorts of resources. So there's one portal built in Hawaii, one portal built in Alaska. We on the East Coast are being neglected, and the reasons those were picked, but they got $1 million grants to build those portals and do the pilots for those. Okay, and then complementary, there are digital referral networks. So one of the problems that exist is that among lawyers, you are a legal service organization, someone comes to you, they don't have the kind of problem that you deal with. And so it's someone who's elderly, but they don't fit your income eligibility. So you then have to call up the legal service provider for the elderly in the same city, in DC, you call them up, they say, well, we might be able to take it, but maybe let me check, with maybe up to capacity, and it might not be a legal problem that we address, and then that person that, we'll talk to them, then that person turns out not to be eligible, goes to the next legal service provider, and there's a whole, what we call referral fatigue, people who don't have resources, who have to go from one place to the next in order to try to get legal representation. And the same occurs in the social services field. People, lawyers recognize that their clients have other kinds of problems besides legal problems, but then they can't find a social service agency that will help. So this is sort of an infrastructure that's automated. The important thing is automated. It's an infrastructure where every one of these service providers inputs information, right? Who they serve, eligibility, and capacity. And then you can use that infrastructure, right? You can use that network, that digital network, in order to connect everybody, rather connect your client to other service providers if you can't serve them. Okay, and then last, this is happening, I think this is really cool. But don't get me wrong, I think both. So we're now moving into a area where we're starting to use data in order to figure out legal needs and pinpoint the places in which you want to concentrate legal resources and legal services, both tech tools and service providers, right? And we're doing a project with an organization called the Self-Represented Litigants Network, in which we are doing, we're mapping legal resources to individual areas at the county level, of which there are more than 3,000 in the United States. Why does it have to be at that level of granularity? Because each of those places are different, the courts have different rules, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big mess. But the hope is to, try to take a bite of figuring out what the legal needs are, what the resources are. So this is the map, is an example of the kind of map that we would want to use to map legal resources. And I picked, for our purposes, Hamilton County, New York, 33.6% of population are age 60 and over. This is from the Census Bureau, which would mean what? If you've got a third of the population that's over, that's 60 and over, how might you think about legal needs in that area? Anybody? I'm trying not to just listen to this one. Yes, go ahead.
Well, they're entering the age of retirement and elder issues, so stuff like the stuff you were talking about.
Exactly. So they're going to have certain kinds of legal needs, right, that are specific to elderly people, some of which we've talked before, and issues around retirement, etc. They may also have issues of mobility, which we talked about some, right? So we're going to have, so that tells us a little piece of what the problems might be, and then what you can do is map onto it what legal resources are available to address those needs, right? What do we have in Hamilton County? Are there any legal service providers? Are there some who have any kind of support to get into homes? Maybe we've got social workers and we can build an app for them so that they can go into the homes of homebound elderly, right? And the same idea. Another example, here's a who knew, Hampshire County, West Virginia, 50% of people, West Virginia is next to Virginia, guys. 20 states. I moved to DC, I never realized how close I was to West Virginia. All right, so almost 50%, no one from here is from West Virginia. All right, 50% of occupied housing is renter occupied in Hampshire County. Who would have guessed, right? We would have thought New York, we would have thought, LA, San Francisco, and those might be also areas in which they are renter occupied. So here we might start thinking about landlord-tenant issues, certain kinds of vulnerability that come with being a tenant and being a low-income person, right? And if you think about it, this is just one layer of information, right? You put them all together. If we now, on top of that, put the income information, the age information about, this census here, and age data and income data, we suddenly get more and more of a picture, at least of the different populations that are out there in each county. And we can at least surmise what kind of legal needs they have and other challenges to getting legal resources. And we can then start, and this is the part that we're started doing at Georgetown, we can start actually going county by county and trying to get our arms around what's there already. Okay, so this is kind of what's happening, I think, moving forward. Okay, so that's kind of the lay of the land for on access to justice digital tools. And now what I want to talk about a little bit are some of the challenges that come up with user-facing tools. So I'm just biting off the chunk. And the chunks that I'm biting off involve tools that support lawyers, tools that support members of the public, think of self-help apps, and non-lawyer service providers or volunteers, tools that support them, and I'm thinking of them as legal assistance apps, CV, social worker apps that I showed you earlier. And they're, as part of their development, there's become a focus on human-centered design. Some of you may have heard of that in this context or other contexts. It's sort of, and if you think about it, it's how Apple has completely hooked us into using its interface, right? And each time it makes a change, it's more beautiful, it's more simple, it's more intuitive. And the idea here is to focus on user experience with human-centered design and to actually design for people, which means design a prototype, go and talk to someone, the likely user, find out what works, what doesn't work, find out what their needs are, go back and do a second prototype, and go back and forth, and really do that for so that your tools are meet the needs, requirements, and even give pleasure and satisfaction to the users. Another analogy for this is an architecture, right? When you build buildings that work, that both give you pleasure and also help with the stream of traffic, et cetera, et cetera. So parks or urban development are, this is a piece of that and comes out of that. Okay, so some thoughts about each of these types. So support for legal services providers, this was a pretty basic app that we built for a legal services organization that allows them to determine the eligibility of people who are interested in using their services and to triage them and to help them to go to if they can't serve them, to send them to other legal resources. And they're really important because they add efficiencies. This legal services organization had people answering the phone in order to determine eligibility. So think about this app as saving, I think now, tens of thousands of hours of people time answering phones, right? So, so really plays an important role in supporting the mission of legal service providers. On the other hand, doesn't really move the ball or change the conversation around access to justice because lawyers are still in the story. And in addition to that, they can't work on their own, right? You can't have a client not be eligible and then tell them tough noogie bits is a technical term, we have nowhere else to send you. And then in addition to that, in this area, not so much eligibility tools, but other tools, lawyers tend to be resistant to anything more sophisticated. That helps, for instance, with triage and assessment, that helps to create a complaint or kind of signals to a lawyer, well, these are high priority, you should do this, these are medium priority, take them, maybe or maybe not, these are lower priority. Lawyers like to make those kinds of decisions on a one-to-one basis. So there's a point at which these kinds of tools are experienced by lawyers as intruding on areas where they want to be the ones making decisions. Okay. Then there's self-help functions, self-help tools, and they are there was a huge amount of enthusiasm from them in the access to justice community, because the idea was that, we were going to do an end run around lawyers, right, and that would be the way in which we address the problem. The kinds of things that the self-help tools do, and I've shown you a few of them before, they provide legal guidance, they create documents that you can file, and you can even they automatically file documents, and they prepare litigants or would-be clients for hearings, right? And this goes back to the interview that I showed you, where you can ask, or I actually didn't show you this, but we built a tool that's an interview that asks someone in an unemployment benefits matter about why they were fired and what were the circumstances, and through a drop-down menu, and then gives them suggestions about what they should bring to the hearing, how strong the case is and what they should bring to the hearing. Okay, so those are the types of things that self-help tools do. And here's one that is educational. This one we never sent out into the world. But this prepares users for hearings under our Inclusive Education Act. The user is a parent and goes to the school and wants to challenge a plan that the school administration has for their child, where the child has certain kinds of disabilities, right? And so this screen asks the user what kind of information they would like, and this involves treating, it's under behavioral problems. And if you check, and I think what I checked here is mechanical restraint, this pop-down menu gives an explanation of what mechanical restraint is, and then says what's not permitted under the Act, cites to the Act, and then allows the user to put the information in the report at the end, so they can print out the report and go to the hearing. I'll skip that for now. Now, some of the advantages of self-help tools is, as I said earlier, they get lawyers out of the picture, or putting it in a little bit more finer way, you can keep your lawyers for the complicated cases and cases where there are gray areas, and for the more straightforward matters, people can help themselves. And as part of that, it's important that users be able to solve their own problems, right? As we try to do in the mostly middle class, upper middle class, do use certain tools to solve our own problems, and we take it for granted that we can solve a lot of them. And it's important to empower people who are low income and modest income to be able to solve their own problems. Some of the more radical possibilities are to empower users to solve not just that particular problem, but a whole series of problems in their life. And poor people in the United States, and I think everywhere, don't just have legal problems, they have lots of other problems. They are vulnerable on financial issues, and they live in a web of legal challenges. And so this may empower them to solve or address those problems, and to educate them about the legal system, right? If you turn all those complicated laws and legalese into plain language, you can educate people so they understand their rights. And ultimately, the great goal is to have users become engaged in the legal system. They now understand the law, they understand how legal institutions work, they mobilize, and they start addressing some of the failures of the legal system and of the political system.
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. Sorry, guys. Some of the risks here. Well, a very fundamental problem. When you have technologies that have law embedded in it, there's a risk that the law is wrong, right? That it says that you should, something, in order to be eligible, you should have 4 times the amount of X, right? And instead, the app or the tool says 3 times the amount of X, right? It says if you meet these conditions, you can have Y, and the conditions are wrong, right? That gets it. So there's a risk that the law that's embedded in the system is wrong. Now, open-ended question that we don't know the answer to is how many times do lawyers get things wrong, right? Not you guys. Never you guys, right? But there are a lot of lawyers out there. There are not a lot of mechanisms to make sure that they that they get it right. There's not a lot of supervision or oversight, right? So we've got to ask ourselves, you know, are these worse, right? Especially if you use what we think of as subject matter experts, people who really know the law in the area, to help you build the app and get and figure out how to embed the law in the tool. Okay, so that's one concern. The second concern, we have this term that comes out of clinical legal education in the United States called client-centered representation. Okay, and you maybe do have the same thing, and I apologize if I'm talking to you already know. But the idea is that you represent the whole person. You don't just deal with a discrete legal problem for 2 reasons. One is, frankly, there are not that many, or at least when you represent individuals, I shouldn't say this, there are quite a few legal problems that relate to other legal problems, right? You manage to get greater alimony from your spouse, and all of a sudden your eligibility for certain benefits disappears, right? So that one legal problem is often connected to another legal problem. As I said earlier, there are also legal problems that are deeply connected to social problems. And so there's an ethos in this, and I'm sure true here, I don't think that, it's because I don't know enough about you suggesting I'm focusing on the United States. That there's an ethos that what a lawyer does is represent the whole client and thinks about all of the legal problems, how they relate, and all the other personal problems that may connect to it. Okay, and that with an app you lose that because an app just focuses on a discrete problem. And this one I think is something really to think about, is that apps entrench the status quo, right? So you put in the law of today. You don't get to challenge the law and say it's unconstitutional or violates some statute. You put in what the law is, and you lose the kind of normative space for arguing, right, for making a case that the law should be different, right? You lose all the aspirational aspects of the law. Okay, so those are some concerns. And then there are concerns. Oops. What did I do? What's happened? Can't believe I got this.
You want X?
Yeah, that's good. Okay. So then, in the answers to Joseph, so I focus on some of the issues that go to generally how apps might have limitations that lawyers representing individuals might not have, or ideally don't have. A second set of problems have to do with dealing with low-income people in the United States, poor people in the United States. And I've categorized them in certain types, but then partly because I want you to understand how huge the problem is. One is the problem of recognizing what a legal problem is. Second is the challenge of accessing the internet and knowing how to search effectively. There's a problem of understanding, which I'll get to, and then there should be disparities of power. So here's when I say recognizing a legal problem, we tend, as lawyers to be, to kind of think, well, how can you not recognize a legal problem? They're everywhere, and I know what they are. This is what you learned after one semester, 2 semesters of law school, right? So here's one that's commonly used as an example. A child has asthma, right? Goes and her parent takes her to a doctor. tries to treat the asthma, seems like it's a medical issue, but going back to the mold, right? Mold could be causing the asthma, and there might be conditions in the apartment that the landlord has to address under the law, right? And so there is a legal problem masking as a medical problem. Financial problems often don't appear to be legal problems. You owe money. The creditors are after you. It's excruciating. You're embarrassed. You're overwhelmed, right? You don't think of it in terms of a legal issue where you actually might have rights. No, they are not allowed to call you at 10 o'clock at night, right? And there are remedies for that in the United States. So there are a lot of different types of problems that present as other than legal problems. And people of modest and low income are very bad at recognizing those. So there's a study that was done by this Rebecca Sanderberg, who's the access to justice expert in the United States, where she asked people about certain kinds of problems that you would take to court or could take to court. And only 90% of them recognized those problems, that those problems were legal. 21% thought that you would address them in your family and you would address them privately. And this is amazing, right? 56% thought that those problems, your landlord kicking you out, or your problem with asthma were part of God's plan, or something that happens in life, or bad luck, right? So even at the get-go, when you're trying to create self-help tools, there are people who don't understand, significant numbers of people, low-income people, who do not understand that they have legal problems. Then, supposing they know there's a legal problem or something like that, well, everyone makes a big deal in the United States that 60 or 70% of people now own mobile phones and have some access to the internet. But I think that hides the reality for low-income people, and that is that you can have a phone. It doesn't mean you use it to search, to get on the internet and search. And if you think about it, what are some of the problems? You have a limited plan, right? And so you're guarding your data. What are you doing with the data? You're texting, right? You're using it for phone calls. You're using it for other kinds of things, right? You're not using it to get answers to questions, right? And second, people have limited search skills. People, even digitally native people, are actually not very good at getting answers, reliable, trustworthy answers to questions they have. And there have been, in the UK, there was a study of young people in their 20s where they were given legal problems and they couldn't actually find the answers on the internet. They would be looking for answers in England when it was obviously not the jurisdiction they were in, that kind of thing. So very limited search skills, right? And then we have what I think is kind of unbelievably shocking. This is not statistics about low-income people. This is the United States. This is the state of literacy in the United States. 14% are functionally illiterate, 34% are marginally literate, 5th to 8th grade, 29% are unable to read a book on the 8th grade level. And significant numbers can't read a bus schedule, can't interpret a newspaper story, can't follow written math instructions. Well, you can put the most plain language stuff you want in your app to explain in the most non-legalese words what the law involves, and people won't be able to read it. People won't be able to read it. Comment, question?
I just wanted to clarify these numbers. So you're saying that 77% of the US population have no
Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying. This is a study done in 2003. Okay, you guys are much better than me, all right? Well, I would have said that even before I put these numbers in front of me. But the study was done in 2003. They repeated a very similar study in 2013, and rates of literacy have not changed. We are failing horrifically when it comes to education. Okay. Okay, and then on top of all these challenges, think of a person who's not a lawyer coming to court. Think of a poor person coming to court. They are going to be taxed in all sorts of ways. First of all, they only have a limited amount of bandwidth because they're afraid that they're going to be kicked out of their house and they're worried that their partners would end up custody of their kids, et cetera, right? So getting them to focus on what they need to know to help themselves going to court, very challenging. And they also don't know things that we kind of figure out by looking around. Where you're supposed to sit, how do you address the judge, how do you dress, right? We're not talking technical stuff, we're talking about the kind of mundanities, right? The stuff that we take for granted. Right? So all of those things raise a question about self-help apps as the main avenue, the main direction for giving people access to justice in the United States. Right? And these are the challenges. That doesn't mean it's not worth building them for certain populations, but it raises the question. And frankly, this is the thing that's the most exciting. Right? We're going to have people help themselves. We don't need other people there. We don't need lawyers. We don't need other service providers. Right? So, how am I doing at time?
About 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Okay. All right. The other thing to remember too, and I mentioned this, when you're dealing with unrepresented people versus people represented by lawyers, there's an uneven playing field, right? So you can give somebody an incredible amount of guidance before they go into court. And then they go into court and the other side is represented by a lawyer, and boom, they lose. And in fact, a colleague of mine at another school in DC did a study of that and found that if you, in landlord-tenant court, the tenants who were prepared by volunteer lawyers in a health center didn't do better than tenants who hadn't been prepared, right? So in courts and in dispute resolution settings, there's a huge power imbalance and no amount of access to justice technologies are going to solve. All right, so the model that's now emerging as the most promising are apps that help people embedded in the community or in social services to help their clients, help lay people. And this is the one I showed you going back, a few minutes ago, the app that we built for social workers who serve the homebound elderly. The goal is to have a whole series of people who are community leaders, who volunteer in court, who work in libraries. I don't know if this is from here, but United States, a lot of homeless people end up in libraries. They're both researching and they're also a roof over their head. Right? Churches, of course, other community organizations, social service providers, as I said, social workers, barber shops. There's now a movement to provide actually healthcare information in barber shops because African American men in the United States in certain cities tend to hang out in barber shops, and barbers are very eager to be helpful there, right? So there's an interesting location to provide legal information. Okay, and this is, again, I don't need to go through this again, but this is the app I showed you earlier involving social workers. You can tell I really like that app. And the idea is to create an ecosystem that empowers people who are new justice actors, right? And so it's not just a question of one app here, one app there, but the much, much harder work of getting the politics and the organizational issues, of getting people on the same page and willing to be connected, network with technologies and other sources. And the goal here, of course, is to have lawyers, in this case, this was in connection with an immigrant app, an immigration app, to connect them with a whole series of people, English as a second language, teachers, etc. And so to help them with their legal needs and, if necessary, bring in an attorney, right? And so that's creating an ecosystem is the gold standard here. I think I'll stop here. Hang on one second, just because I do want to save some time for questions. Oh yeah, so one more thing to say about this. As I said, there's an organizational challenge, right? Getting organizations to play together, it's not easy. They all have their own agenda, they're all in their own interests. Sometimes, but that's actually why Alaska got a portal, is because everyone played very well together, and they demonstrated it in a grant application. All the service providers, legal service and non-legal service providers, they're all in it. But the other wrinkle, big wrinkle, is in the United States, and possibly here in some of the spots, unauthorized practice of law. And that's the, how many of you have heard of unauthorized practice of law? All right.
They've been on a few weeks.
Okay. I did the wrong word. Right? No, they all come back in the right. Okay, so unauthorized practice of law. In the United States, every state has a statute that criminalizes, penalizes the provision of legal services by non-lawyers, lawyers that are not admitted in the bar, right? And depending on the state, the scope of the statute is very broad. Most of the time it's a misdemeanor, right? That's why I said, oh, it's a misdemeanor. I think in a couple states it's felony for a non-lawyer to provide legal services. And they're very broad, so they cover, here, I can cover. Oh no, I lost it. So never mind, sorry. So unauthorized practice of law covers giving advice, covers going to court on behalf of someone, covers helping them create documents, and in the states where non-lawyers have been most successful as a nexus between people and the legal system, those states have limited the unauthorized practice of law so those people could those service providers could navigate and be of assistance, right? Because in other states, so in DC, there's a very broad statute that says if you create documents, if you give legal advice, if you help somebody in court, you are engaging in unauthorized practice of law, goodbye, don't do it again, pay a fine, and we never want to see you again, okay? So incredible limitation on creating the kind of ecosystem that I was talking about, right? Because you can't have non-lawyers help. And we finesse it, we're not allowed to give advice, we provide information, so we draw that line, there's already a line there, and we figure out other ways to get around the provisions, but it's a huge impediment to creating these kinds of communities. All right, now I'll stop there.
Perfect, thank you.